Welcome to the Science for Sport podcast, where we dive into stories and insights that drive peak performance. Join us as we uncover the secrets behind the science of success. Here's your host, Richard Graves.
Hello and welcome to this latest edition of the Science for Sport podcast with me, Richard Graves. In this week's episode, we're moving our focus onto America's game, the NFL, an organisation openly embracing research and committing millions of dollars of its own money in order to find ways of improving equipment and making the game as a whole safer for everybody involved. Dr. Alan Sills is the NFL's Chief Medical Officer, joining us to discuss this, and we can hear from him now.
Unlocking sports science to push the limits of human potential. This is the Science for Sport podcast.
Dr. Sills, we're delighted you've joined us on this week's episode of the Science for Sport podcast. As we sit here recording this edition, it's the start of Thanksgiving week in the States, which means obviously that the NFL calendar is a little bit more congested than the standard regular season week. And I'm sure your own schedule is as well. So for those listeners that perhaps aren't familiar with you and your background, give them a brief resume and give us an idea of the extent to which your remit goes in the NFL.
Sure. So I'm Alan Sills. I'm Chief Medical Officer of the National Football League. I'm a neurosurgeon in my practice and training. So I've practiced in neurosurgery for over 30 years, treated athletes with a variety of brain and spine conditions. Most of my research work has been in sport concussion, and so that was the work that led me to the NFL, but I've worked in the NBA and the NHL and in some international sport organizations and U.S. Olympic organizations. So been the NFL's Chief Medical Officer since 2017. And what that means is that I work with all of our clubs and their medical staffs. Obviously, each of our clubs has a very extensive medical and performance staff. I work with all of them to help facilitate our game day care, to make sure that we implement all of our protocols with regard to emergency preparedness, concussion protocol, and so forth. I also help oversee our research efforts. The NFL is a large body of medical research that we do, both on our own data and on our own injuries, but also on equipment and on other innovations to make sports safer. And then I'm still a liaison, obviously, to a lot of other levels of play and to other medical organizations. So that's kind of how I divide my time and my relationship with the league.
You referred to concussion protocol there. It's a phrase that a decade ago, not just in the NFL, but across any sport, it wasn't really a widely used or maybe even widely known phrase. Give us an idea of how that has developed and what it means in terms of the National Football League now.
Yeah, well, I think you're exactly right that's been one of the biggest evolutions in American football are the development and the implementation of these concussion protocols. I like to say now, Richard, that our players have grown up with a concussion protocol. They had it when they were in, school-based football levels. They've had it in university, and now they obviously have it in the NFL. So they know what it is, and they can come to expect it and to participate. So the protocol is really, think of it like a recipe. If you're going to try to make something, you want to follow an order of events and ingredients so that you do the same thing every time. And that's what our protocol is. It's a recipe for how we're going to examine a player who might be injured. One important point for fans to know is being in the protocol doesn't mean that you've been diagnosed with a concussion. What it means is someone has recognized a possible injury and they think the player needs to be evaluated. And so the protocol specifies how are we going to examine that player? What data are we going to use? How do we interpret it? And if we do diagnose a concussion, how do we then return that player to participation? So every NFL player gets the same exact exam done in the same exact order. Everyone who's diagnosed has to return through the same exact pathway, and that's really what our protocol is. Lastly, I would tell you it's a living and breathing document. It's something we're constantly evaluating and refining and revising based on emerging science and our own experience rather. And so that's something that we are continuously working to improve.
Yeah, and how has that evolved over the years? Because many people listening to this podcast, I'm somebody that's in my 40s, growing up as a kid. I'd play football, soccer, as you would call it in the States, play rugby. You'd take a blow to the head and you might have someone come on and say, can you see my finger? How many am I holding up? If you can call it right, that's it. On you go and play. Well, that's no longer the case. It's a very different world we live in.
It is. One of my colleagues used to say they would ask you, how many fingers am I holding up? And you got 3 guesses, and if you got it right at any point, you were clear. That's not how we do it anymore. So again, we look for two things to trigger the protocol. One is a blow to the head or neck area, and then two, what we call injury behavior. So not every blow to the head or neck area means you need an evaluation, but if you do get a blow to the head or neck area and you have some form of injury behavior, then we're going to examine you. What does that injury behavior look like? Well, obviously it can be very visible signs like being unconscious or having an impact seizure, the so-called fencing posture, or being ataxic, where someone's sort of stumbling around and can't keep their balance. Those are the obvious ones that you can sort of see from a mile away, as we say. But there are other more subtle signs like being slow to get up or maybe clutching at the head, or there may be symptoms that the player themselves experience that you can't see, things like headache or dizziness or memory problems, concentration problems, or sensitivity to noise or light. Those are things that we can't see on video or even from the sideline, and so that's where we have to rely on players to speak up, and that's a big part of initiating that protocol as well. So sometimes the protocol is initiated based on what someone sees on the field, that injury behavior, but other times it's a player themselves or a teammate or a coach or a game official that speaks up and says, you know what, I heard this or I saw this, I think this player needs an exam. And any of those things are enough to trigger that examination and initiate the protocol.
And as somebody with a medical background like yourself, just how invaluable down the years has medical scientific research been in developing the protocol? Because, you know, we see heavy collisions in different sports, and it's not necessarily somebody slow to get up or looking dizzy. It might be a clenched fist, spasm of an arm. These are symptoms that, like I said, a decade ago would not have even been related to a concussion.
Well, I think there's been a tremendous change in the awareness of concussion and what it is, and the fact that it is a serious injury and a brain injury, and that we always want to detect it and report it. And so, once again, I go back to player self-reported behavior. You know, we look at our data on this very carefully, and over the past 5 years, we've had typically around 40 to 50% of all of our concussions where a player themselves, a teammate or coach, somebody non-medical has initiated that evaluation. Now stop and think about that for a minute. That means almost half of the evaluations we have some component of player self-report. And that's a major change. As I mentioned, I've been doing this for almost 30 years. That certainly didn't happen 20 or 30 years ago, maybe not even 10 years ago. So it reflects the fact that everyone's more educated about brain injuries now. They understand how important they are. They understand the importance of speaking up about it. And, you know, there obviously is a culture in sport of playing through injury, right? Sometimes your knee is
Yeah.
sore, your elbow is stiff, and you just have to kind of get through that and get out there and give it your best. The brain's not like that. We always say you can't play through a brain injury. So this is a different injury. It's always important to recognize, diagnose, and speak up about it and get treatment started right away.
I know in the National Football League now, in each stadia on any given game day, there's independent spotters around the stadium, and their sole remit is to try and highlight players that might be suffering from potential symptoms. I wonder how difficult it was for the National Football League as an organisation to convince all 32 teams and the staff and the players that this was the way to go, because you've just touched upon it there. It doesn't matter what sport you play, especially in a male-dominated environment, there has been down the years this sense of, well, if you can play through an injury, then you do so.
Yeah. Well, I think it has been an evolution. So I was one of the first unaffiliated neurotrauma consultants that the NFL hired back in 2013 to work on the sidelines. That was my first real relationship with the NFL, was serving in that role for one of our cities. And so I've seen the evolution. And you're right. Obviously, when we first started, everyone was new to this, and you know, no one sort of knew like who's looking over my shoulder to do what, and you know, are there going to be differences of opinion? But I think what we've come to realize is two things. Number one, it's impossible to see the entire field from the sideline. You just can't. I mean, these are very, very large men that play the game. They're moving at a very high rate of speed. They're covering big distances. And no matter being right on the sideline, you cannot possibly see everything that's happening with all 22 players that are happening in various parts of the field. So having those spotters and those medical personnel up above in an elevated position, giving them access to all the video, make sure that we really can see the field in a comprehensive way. The other thing is that I've seen this evolve, Richard, to where now we recognize it takes an entire system of people to make these diagnoses and to make sure that we get this right. And so I think our team doctors and the players themselves appreciate that we've got this network of people and that they're all there really for only one reason, and that's to make sure that we pick up anybody who might be injured and prevent them from getting further injury. So, yes, we know that players want to play and fans want to see players play, but there's an acknowledgement again, this is a serious injury. If someone's injured, let's get them off, get them the appropriate evaluation and care, and not just sort of keep going.
And I've got to say, this is a concept using spotters that isn't used widely across every sport. So for those listening in that are experts and familiar with different sporting arenas, how does that whole system work? Because obviously, if you're in the top tier of a 90,000 seat stadium, you can't shout down it and stop the game. There has to be some sort of protocol and communication method.
Yeah, so in the NFL, we're really lucky with the system that we do have. So up in an elevated position, typically up where maybe the media are sitting, we have 5 individuals in a protected booth. So it's a booth that's dedicated to them. They're the only people that are in there. Those 5 individuals consist of 2 athletic trainer spotters. So they're like what you might think of as physios in European football leagues. And they are trained in American football, have experience in levels outside the NFL typically. One of them watches one team, one watches the other team. And again, they're looking for any and all signs of injury behavior. They're supported by a very extensive video system, the Hawkeye video system that's used by a lot of sports around the world. That lets them have access to every single camera that's inside the stadium. For a typical NFL game, that's probably between 30 and 40 cameras, can be up to 60 cameras. And so each one of those spotters has all that technology. They also have a technician that supports them with that video to help them find angles, go back and look at replays and things like that. The 5th person that's in that booth is an unaffiliated neurotrauma consultant. So that's again a physician who's expert in brain and spine injury, who's again looking at the entire field, working with the spotters, looking at the video, again looking for any signs of injury. And most importantly, then, that entire network, those 5 people in that booth, they're connected by radio to the sidelines so they can talk to the team medical staffs and tell them if they see someone who's injured or that needs an exam. And they're connected to the game referee, the person who's wearing the white hat on the field, because they have the ability to tell the referee to stop the game if they see someone who's on the field that they think might be injured and is continuing to play. So we empower them to literally stop the game, stop the action, just based on their interpretation that there may be an injured player. And so that system, as you said, has evolved. It is a very integrated system, and it works really well, with the ultimate goal, again, being make sure that anybody who's injured can be brought off and examined.
I wonder, when I'm listening to you talk us through this process, is there an element at times of protecting players from themselves a little bit? The idea that you've got impartial observers interjecting themselves into games because they suspect something might be wrong. How important is that, and was that a major consideration?
Well, it is a consideration. I mean, again, we know that there's a culture in sport of sort of playing through injury. We know that players don't want to let their teammates down, and sometimes they might continue to try to play on even if they know they're injured. That's just part of the culture of sport and a culture of elite athletes who want to be out there and want to perform. So I do think that, we in the Players Association working together would say, yeah, sometimes we do have to sort of save the player from themselves. But again, they're a very active participant as well, which is so important with concussion. One of the things that's unique about concussion among all other medical conditions is we are so reliant still today on the player or the patient themselves speaking up about their symptoms and being an active participant. So, we don't have an x-ray or a blood test or something that today is ready to make that diagnosis. So we really need that cooperation and participation of the patient. And that's why having them as part of the process, getting them educated about it, and having them really participate is crucial to success.
Of course, all of this takes research, and that requires money. In the NFL's case, I know down the years, it's millions of dollars that you've committed and continue to commit in order to research neuroscience, to research improved safety equipment for players and staff alike. And I know several years ago, we took a tour of the new Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, which the NFL had an input into the facilities. Of course, there's 2 regular season games held there every year now. So walk us through, if you can, what all that looks like in reality.
Yeah, well, I like to say it's probably one of the most fun parts of my job is the ability to help sponsor that research and have that data. So we really have more data almost about concussion than anyone, because we have all 32 of our teams reporting their injuries to a centralized electronic health record. We have obviously reports from game day from all those different personnel I mentioned, the personnel in the booth, the independent doctors on the sideline, the team medical staff. We've got participation data. All our players wear a GPS tracking device, so we know exactly where they are on the field, how far they're moving, how fast. We tag their equipment. We know exactly what helmet they're wearing because we scan that and know how to associate that with each player. And then, as I mentioned before, we've got all that video that we have that we can break down and look at the biomechanics of injury. So when you take all of that data together, we have the ability to look at injury in a very comprehensive way that almost no other league has. And so that's what we've done to try to understand how are concussions occurring, and of course, most importantly, how we can prevent them. And so when we think about concussion prevention, we think about things like equipment. How do we design better equipment to reduce the forces that could happen? We think about the rules and the laws of the game, and we've made a lot of adjustments there to try to outlaw behaviors that might lead to injury. And then, of course, we've got a lot of training, teaching, coaching techniques, things that we can bring back to players and coaches and show them behaviors that are associated with injury. So, again, you're right. It takes a lot of time and money and research to do that. We've got great partners. But again, it goes back to sharing all that data and sharing all of those observations together that allows us to really understand these injuries in a comprehensive way. And that's not just for concussion. We're doing the same thing for ankle injuries and knee injuries and shoulder injuries and a variety of other injuries. So again, I like to say it's the most fun part of my job because as a physician and a researcher, you'd love to have access to that amount of data and the ability to really look at things in that kind of systematic way.
Well, I'm glad you made a point of saying it's not just about head injuries, because one of the things that stood out to me when we took a tour of Tottenham Stadium was the facilities that are literally within 30 feet of the pitch side area. If a player's injured, he gets initially in the NFL diagnosed in the blue tent. If a diagnosis is needed, if it goes one step further, it's to the locker room. And then some of the facilities in there are as good as any hospital that I've seen.
Well, they really are. And we often jokingly say that if you're going to have a medical emergency outside of a hospital, an NFL field might be the safest place. And that's because we have all of the personnel and the equipment standing by to really deal with sort of any and all life-threatening emergencies. We hope to never use that, and most of the time fans never see that, but it is always present, and that's one of the things that we really take very seriously. So again, whether it's an international game at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium or at Wembley, whether it's the Super Bowl, a preseason game, or regular season game, our medical preparation is always the same across the board. We've got all the same personnel, all the same equipment, and we've practiced and have a plan for that facility. So that really starts months in advance. We have a dedicated and what we call emergency action plan for each facility. We know exactly how we're going to treat any and all emergencies. We've got equipment and personnel there, and then we practice that. In the off season, we go through drills. If we're doing an international game, for example, we'll come in and do drills there. And so our teams are really, really skilled and prepared for these kind of emergencies because it is different in an NFL player. One thing, they're wearing all that equipment that you've got to be able to remove to quickly give life-saving medical care. Secondly, these, again, are very large human beings. They're much larger than you might think. They often wouldn't fit, for example, on a typical stretcher or things like that. So all those are things we have to think about, sort of prepare for in advance. And it's why I say that I think that we've induced a high margin of safety there at those fields. You mentioned the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, beautiful facility, and you're exactly right. Just right off pitch side, there's a room there that's almost like a miniature trauma bay or an accident room at a healthcare facility. Again, very well equipped to deal with life-threatening emergencies, and so we have a high degree of comfort of being there that we have that as a backup if needed.
Obviously, in order to make it all come together and work, education is vital to get buy-in from everybody else. How high on your agenda when you come to each off-season? You mentioned rule changes. NFL fans will be acutely aware that this season, massive change in the kickoff rules. Again, all with the aim of improving player safety. Equally, you'll have seen some players going around with what are called guardian helmets. That they look like oversized caps that shouldn't really be there. But again, clearly, there's rationale behind this reasoning. So how important is it that everybody is educated and everybody buys in and understands what the aim is of this?
Yeah, we think it's absolutely essential. I mean, our commissioner said something once that I thought was really profound and that we sort of live by, which is we believe the game can always be made both safer and more exciting. Those don't have to be mutually exclusive goals. And that's really where we take our charge is how do we make the game safer? And I think sometimes in the past there might have just been a culture that says, well, it's sport. People are going to get hurt, right? And we just sort of accept that there are going to be injuries. And listen, I think there always will be some injuries in sport. I mean, that is part of the nature of the body performing under those circumstances. But we can always do better. And so as we learn more, we feel obligated to make these changes and interventions, as you said, whether it's on rules or equipment. I mean, these are things that we always are looking at, because at the end of the day, players want to be out there playing, fans want to see the best players playing, and so everything we can do to keep them healthy and safe is good for everybody. And so it's about taking all that data that we talked about earlier and looking at it critically with a bunch of experts, and together with players, with coaches, with all of our stakeholders, and saying, how can we do better here? And so we challenge ourselves every year to do that. We look a lot at what we call burden, which means not just how many injuries do we have, but how much time do players miss. And so we sort of classify what are the things that keep players off the field. And that helps focus our research efforts and our policy efforts, is how do we really attack those things that are most common. And your listeners and your fans might be interested to know the number one burden injury in the NFL, the thing that causes players to miss more time than any other injury. It's not concussion. It's not knee injuries. It's actually soft tissue injuries, strains, things like hamstring strains or calf strains. That is the number one time loss injury in the NFL. We have a lot of them. They don't miss the entire season, but they'll miss a number of weeks. And when you add it all together, it's the number one driver of players off the field. So those are the kind of insights and observations we use, again, to say, where do we need to focus our efforts, and how can we bring appropriate change?
As always, it's fantastic that so much effort is put into player welfare and improving the safety of the game. As you pointed out earlier, you've been the Chief Medical Officer now with the National Football League since 2017. If my maths is right, you're now in your 8th year. Are there tangible statistics, figures to show that all this hard work, all this research is actually bearing dividends on the field of play?
Yeah, there definitely are. And we look at a number of metrics to really answer the question, is the game getting safer? And so we look at things like that injury burden that I just mentioned. We look at player games missed, how many games are players available for. And if you look at last season, for example, we had over 200 more player games available, savings of injury than what we had the season before. Our concussion numbers in the last several seasons have been down 25 to 30% for where they were prior to this most recent portfolio of changes we've made. We've seen our leg soft tissue strains that I just mentioned go down, 20 to 30% through our preseason and extending into the regular season. So we are looking at those numbers very critically. We hold ourselves to a very high standard, but we are seeing progress there. And we know there's no more work to be done. We always say there's no finish line in health and safety. But I am proud of the work that has happened and the changes that we've seen, particularly in those areas that we just mentioned.
And to what extent does that then work hand in hand with the rules committee when they're looking at how they can improve the game, both as a spectacle for us, the fans, but as you say, importantly there as well for the players' safety, so that they actually spend more time on the field of play than off it?
Yeah, that's something that I've also seen evolve just over the 8 years I've been in the league. So now we in health and safety work very closely with the rules committee in the off season. They're incredibly interested in our data. They want to know what observations that we're finding, what suggestions we have. And the kickoff play that you mentioned is a great example of that. The kickoff play was our most injurious play, had more injuries of all types than any other play, concussions, ACL, all these significant injuries. And we had seen that for a while. We had been trying to work on the play. We just couldn't kind of come up with a way to overcome some of the intrinsic risk, which was space and speed. Really large men running at a very high rate of speed and having collisions. So last year there was a major overhaul. But again, that was an effort where coaches and the rules committee and players and, and us on the health and safety side worked together to try to craft something that we thought would be safer and yet still exciting. Because you go back to what I said before, how can it be exciting yet also safer at the same time? And so there is tremendous integration. This is not a fight, if you will, and it's not a matter of one group telling the other. I mean, we come in with the health and safety observations, but we need the coaches then to bring their perspective and say, well, this is what we see, and this is how we could take that observation and maybe change something about what we're doing in a way that, makes it safer, but also preserves that element of excitement. So the kickoff to me is a great example of that. again, we may well be continuing to tinker with that some, and we'll see what happens this off season. But again, I think that's part of this evolution of how can we always do better? How can we improve on things? And how can we let the data drive us? And I think that's the other really big key I would tell you is this is all based on what the data is telling us, not just on our opinions or, what we'd like to see, but where is the injury data really leading us?
Yeah, absolutely. And the NFL, as we've touched upon, is becoming an increasingly global game with 5 international games being played this regular season. That's going to increase from next season onwards. Commissioner Roger Goodell has already told us that, with new markets being exposed to the National Football League. Madrid, Spain will be on next year's calendar. But with that comes greater scrutiny, of course, doesn't it? Greater attention and no doubt greater interest from sporting leagues in other areas. I know when you've been on recent trips to the UK, you've been part of forums that have incorporated the Premier League and Rugby Union and World Rugby. How closely do these organisations work together, and how valuable is it for you to share your learnings with them and equally glean anything that could be useful coming back the other way?
Again, I think this has been a major change over the last decade, and really COVID actually even accelerated that. I mean, I think we had always associated with each other and we had met with each other periodically, but during COVID, we all had to bond together to learn from each other and say, how are you coping with this, and what are you doing, and what can we learn from each other? So it drew the leagues around the world closer together, I think, than ever. And I'm happy that we've really maintained that. So as you mentioned, when we were in the UK this fall, we did meet with, I think, 9 different groups, including the cricket board and several of the rugby leagues and the Premier League. And again, it's about sharing our experience, sharing our data, talking about what we're researching and where we're making advances, and also learning the same from them, because all of these leagues have really thoughtful and talented scientists who are working with them, great physicians and physios and performance managers. And so we really do want to learn from each other, and I think there is a lot of commonality. I mean, all of these leagues, for example, have soft tissue strains that they're trying to deal with, and they have knee injuries, and obviously concussions and head knocks are a thing for many of us to deal with. So the more we can share, the more we can collaborate with each other, it's better for athletes everywhere. And so we always say that health and safety shouldn't be a competitive thing. It shouldn't be something where one club has an advantage on another because they can keep their players safer. We think this is something that should apply to everyone. It's not, as we say, the secret sauce of how we're better than someone else. And so we want to make sure we give all of our clubs access to that, but also athletes in other leagues and around the world. And let's make sports safer at all levels. And importantly, how can we take what we're doing at the professional level and translate it to the community level? I mean, you mentioned a minute ago some of the resources we have, and we often say things like, well, we know that a community level American football game, let's say, they're not going to have all these medical professionals and all this elaborate video and all the things we spoke about. But you can still have a concussion protocol. You can still have an emergency plan for what's going to happen if there's a medical emergency. You can have a trained medical person there. And so it's just taking that initiative to think ahead, plan ahead, and communicate about this and make it a priority. And so, again, that's something I think we've worked with these other leagues on, and something that we all are trying to carry out to all levels of sport.
How beneficial is that for you to hear from counterparts in different areas, in different sports? As you say, it's only something really post-pandemic that you've been exposed to. But I guess there'll always be something that perhaps you hadn't considered or thought of that suddenly hits you and think, oh, hang on, this can be transferred.
Absolutely. I can give you a couple of examples. So the RFU, is doing some brilliant work in biomarkers associated with concussion, and they've done some elegant research there. That's research that's still ongoing. We're very interested in that work and learning from them and seeing how that might apply to our game. World Rugby obviously has done a lot with the instrument and mouth guards that I'm sure you're familiar with. The Premier League's done a lot of work in hamstring strains, because that's a major driver of injury for their players and time loss. And so we absolutely are open to those observations. And again, they're brilliant researchers and doctors all around the world. Elite athletes are present in all these sports, and so I'll tell you, one of the secrets for us, if we go into a new market, like you mentioned going into Madrid, people often say, well, how do you start to find medical care? Well, you look for who's taking care of the elite athletes in that market. And there are always, physicians and physios and performance managers who are looking after the most elite athletes. And so we're very keen to learn from them, to partner with them when we're in those markets and caring for our own athletes. But again, it has been a really, really important part of our evolution, and something that we plan to continue moving forward.
Yeah, you mentioned soft tissue injuries, new mouthguard technology, biomarkers. We've obviously spoken about concussion protocol. In your time with the NFL, what do you think has been the one area where you've seen greatest growth, greatest progress, if you like?
I think it's really in the players' awareness of and participation in this injury management. I mean, players now, as I mentioned earlier, very quick to speak up about concussion and concussion symptoms. They're very actively engaged in equipment choices. So, for example, in American football, the helmets. Helmets have evolved tremendously over the course of the past decade in terms of how they can mitigate against force. And so there's been a lot of research in that. And you could probably imagine in any sport, athletes aren't keen to change things that have made them successful, right? If you've been a
Athletes like
university football
familiarity,
player,
don't they?
right? We all are like that. We all have our favorite tennis racket or our favorite set of golf clubs, and we want to just keep using that. So for NFL players, it's hard to change something like the helmet that you've become accustomed to. But as the data and the science shows, hey, this is a safer model. This is something that can reduce my risk of injury. We've seen players engage with that data and buy into it and switch to these safer helmets. So I think that's been a tremendously important advance. And again, it kind of reflects what we're seeing in all of medicine, right? I mean, I think about when I was a kid, which is a very, very long time ago, the physician sort of walked in the room and said, okay, here's what you're going to do. And they told you what to do and you went and did it. And there was really no exchange of information. Nowadays, today, patients are informed. They read about things, they have questions, and we want them to be active participants in their care. And so I think sport is no different. These athletes want to be active participants in their health and well-being. And I think that's a tremendous change. And it's something that is very important and is very satisfying. And I would say with that, the coaches the same way. I spend a lot of my time now talking with coaches, talking about issues, educating them, hearing their feedback. That probably didn't happen 10 or 20 years ago. Coaches did their thing, medical did their thing. But now seeing that come together for the better of sport, I think is a huge change and something that's really important and something that's going to make sports safer as we continue moving forward. I think we'll see very, very different outcomes and very different experiences for players moving forward than what we've seen in the past as a result of that collaboration.
Well, we started this conversation, Dr. Sills, with me highlighting it's Thanksgiving week, and I know there's a busy schedule ahead. So we'll finish up with one question, which might be a little bit too broad to answer, but we'll go for it anyway. What is next? We've seen over the last 7.5 years this dramatic progression, not just behind the scenes with things you don't see, but visibility. We talked about Guardian helmets. You can see mouthguard technology coming on. You've got the blue tents on the sidelines. What's next that we'll notice, obviously, or we'll see a dramatic change in, do you feel?
Yeah, I think the equipment is going to continue to evolve. You'll continue to see better equipment. Obviously, the helmets will evolve. We're looking at shoulder pads, the pads that players wear over their shoulders. Cleats and footwear, I think, are a big area where we can continue to make progress. We're doing a lot of work on playing surfaces, and I think you'll continue to see our understanding and maintenance of those continue to evolve. But then the game itself. I mean, again, I think we're in an era where we want the game to be exciting, but we also have to look at those elements that are causing injury. And so I think fans will see continued evolution. I mean, we've made over 50 rule changes just in the last decade based on health and safety. And so I think you'll see that continue. So again, the work's never done. There's no finish line for this, but I do hope that you'll continue to see those changes, because I think that means we're doing our job of trying to look for ways that we can, again, keep the best players on the field and make it as safe as possible for them so that they can participate and fans can enjoy seeing these incredibly gifted and talented athletes do what they do best.
What is it they say? There is no off season. I know that applies to you and your team for sure. Listen, we really appreciate you taking the time to join us on this week's episode. I know it's a busy week. I know you're going to be acutely aware of the number of eyes upon the National Football League and the coverage that you get over this holiday period over in the States. So once again, thank you very much for your time, and we wish you all the very best with the rest of the season.
Hey, thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and happy to come back anytime and chat further about this. And all best wishes to you and your listeners as well for the remainder of the year and the holiday season.
Unlocking sports science to push the limits of human potential. This is the Science for Sport podcast.
Many thanks to Dr. Alan Sills, the Chief Medical Officer of the National Football League, for taking the time to join us on this week's edition of the Science for Sport podcast. I'm sure, like me, you found much of what he had to say both insightful and useful. And if you want to find out more, then you can do so by visiting our website, scienceforsport.com. If you've enjoyed this week's podcast, then help us spread the word by sharing it with a coach, a colleague, an athlete, or a friend. The more people we can get downloading the podcast, the easier it becomes for us to attract top athletes and people at the very top of their profession. That wraps it up for this week's episode. I hope, like me, you enjoyed it, and I look forward to talking to you again next week on the next edition of the Science for Sport podcast.
Subscribe to the Science for Sport podcast now, wherever you listen to your podcasts. For more insights, resources, and to join the Academy, visit scienceforsport.com and connect with us on social media by searching for @ScienceForSport. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.